IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Sariu Natarajan.
And I am Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And today we are joined by Dr. Hugo Gorringe from the University of Edinburgh.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us, Hugo.
Thank you for asking me.
So very quickly, Dr. Hugo's work has focused on social and political movements both in South India and Scotland. His research in India focuses on the socio-political mobilization of Dalit and their struggle to achieve equality and deepen Indian democracy. This research is the basis for the book Untouchable Citizens, which explores the interplay between Dalit movements and democratization in South India. He has also written about Dalit politics, collective violence, identity politics, institutionalization, and the construction and negotiation of the social space. He is currently working on the institutionalization of the VCK.
Viduthalai Chirutaigal Kachi, for those who want to know what that is.
Yes, and his research in Scotland focuses on the interactive dynamics between police and protesters. More recently, he has been involved in a research project on young yes voters in the Scottish referendum with Maddie Breeze, Michael Rossi, and Lynn Jamieson. Welcome to the podcast, Hugo.
Thank you.
So just let's start off right away. And for those of you who have been listening to our episodes, you would know that we have spoken to Dr. Gopal Guru on the issue of reservations in jobs and educational institutions. But in this particular episode, we want to focus on the political aspect of representation. You may recall that that was one issue that we sort of decided to speak about later, and that is sort of why we want to speak to Dr. Hugo Gorringe today. We sort of want to talk about Dalit politicians and how they may represent claims on behalf of their community, how do they negotiate democratic politics, and basically the differences in different states across the country. But let's start by talking about your book, Panthers in Parliament. Can you just take our listeners through some of the basic points that you make in this book?
Sure. Panthers in Parliament is in many ways a sequel to the first book, Untouchable Citizens, and it looks at what happens when a Dalit political party enters the institutions of power. So back in the late 1990s, Dalit Panthers E06, Dalit Panthers of India, Tamil Nadu branch, called themselves a radical social movement. They plunged to hit back, they used violence, and they tried to create a sense of empowerment amongst the people. This militant organization in 1999 formed itself into a party, the VCK, and contested political elections. They've never been hugely successful, but at various points they've had a couple of MLAs or one MP. At the current moment, they have two MPs in Parliament. Right. And so the book basically charts what happens to the movement turned party. And it engages with the themes that everyone's familiar with, the maxim that power corrupts. And actually, we see some of that playing out with the Dalit political parties as well.
Right. And just to go into the point about the Dalit political parties, the Dalit Panther movement began in Maharashtra.
Yes.
And the variation in Tamil Nadu, the Viduthalai Chirutaigal Kachi, the VCK, is a regional variation in some senses.
So it's always been more than semi-autonomous, and now it is completely stands on its own 2 feet. But it started led by Malaichammy as the DPI. It was called in Tamil Nadu Dalit Panther Iyakam or Dalit Panther Movement. But there are, a series of letters between Malaichammy and leaders in Maharashtra, and it set itself up as a branch of the wider movement before finally taking, its own stance on issues and growing into the party it has become today.
So, to your point around the VCK being having its origins in a social movement or in sort of some of the movement language, could you talk about two things? One is the process of how a political party. And to that extent, your book does talk about it. How does the political party, how does the social movement begin to institutionalize, and in what ways, and in what manner does it sort of begin to bring together and sort of articulate a political vision as well? And also, secondly, talk a little bit more about how, if there are other examples of political parties that don't come from a movement background, is in some way the history of the BSP different in that it articulated political ideals, or does it in many ways have social roots or roots in a specific form of a social movement or specific articulation?
Right. So how does the social movement begin to institutionalize? I think you see this in many different ways, the simplest of which is language. So as a social movement, as a radical actor, you can castigate your rivals using very colorful language, which is not permissible for a political party. So the VCK as a movement used to condemn both the DMK and the ADMK, the two regional parties in Tamil Nadu, as rogues and scoundrels. Once they become a political party, then they have to temper their language. So that's one thing. Immediately, there's a change in terms of how they present themselves. Secondly, there's a big change in the tactics they can adopt. So like I say, they used to talk about a hit for a hit, fight back, contest casteism by fighting back against the dominant castes. And again, the language of militancy has to be attenuated when you join politics. You have to tone that down. You have to follow the democratic path. And that alienated quite a lot of people. Some people who saw themselves as radical actors were disillusioned by the sense of becoming just another politician. But the most pervasive way in which movements are institutionalized comes because they're then structured into the party political system. The only way you can win elections in India is to reach out beyond the Dalit vote, because Dalits don't form a majority in any given constituency. So then you're forced to reach out to other castes, to other groups, and in the Tamil context, to other parties. Because actually, even the recent elections show that it's impossible to win without an alliance with one of the two main Dravidian parties. So the VCK then start making links with the Dravidian parties, and then you have what I've called a process of informal institutionalization. What I mean by that is, before there'd be a caste atrocity, the VCK would be there in numbers protesting, demanding the arrest of culprits, demanding the filing of an FIR. Now there's a caste-based atrocity, but their allied parties will phone them up and say, look, we know the perpetrators. You might want to think about this. Come together. Let's talk about this. Let's settle this out of court. So they're forced into forms of compromise, negotiation and bargaining that they didn't have to do before. In terms of the social movement backgrounds of it, I think it's quite similar to the BSP in many ways. The BSP also grew out of mass mobilization, maybe not to the same degree, but there was a huge amount of Dalit grassroots mobilization that fed into the BSP, as well as the backward and minorities caste foundation set up by Kanshi Ram. And you have many of the same debates. Sudhar Pai's work on the BSP shows that there was, the activists there share the same disillusionment with the party becoming more bureaucratic and more institutionalized. So I think there are parallels rather than huge differences here.
Interesting. And this process of institutionalization, and you highlighted sort of informal processes and the compromises they entail. And how does that fit with the broader social movement and perhaps some of the more radical elements within parties? How is this viewed, and how is this, because the fundamentals around marginalization perhaps remain unchanged, or they might take on new forms, but the politicization or sort of the institutionalization of political parties end up compromising on some of these dimensions. And is there a conflict, and how is that tussle dealt with?
Yeah, no, it generates a huge conflict because, of course, for the militant activist, being a radical is part and parcel of their identity. It's how they see themselves. And so entering politics and becoming a political player entails not just a change in strategy or tactics, which is how the leadership presented it. It entails a change in identity and how you see yourself. And that's a big issue that people have. There was a huge amount of disillusionment with the party. They felt that they weren't being radical enough, that they weren't pressing Dalit issues enough, and that they had diluted, most of their core demands. As an example of that, again, this speaks to the issue of institutionalization and how informal processes work with that. When they were in alliance with either the DMK or the ADMK, the VCK would condemn caste atrocities on the ground. They would stage protests. They would continue the actions that they used to continue as a social movement, but they would be silent on those issues when they shared platforms. So you had this dual process where caste remained confined to the movement aspects of the party and was silenced from the mainstream. That is slowly starting to change, but it's only starting to change because of the huge amounts of criticism that the leadership have faced.
That's a very interesting point, because in a sense, what therefore is the, I hate to use this term because it's used so much in the context of civil society rather than politics, theory of change, let's say. Like, how then does a political party, which started off as the radical activist movement, sell its changed, not status, but changed tactics and changed approach to its constituency? It's one thing to realize, okay, that there's going to be a radical wing which is never going to agree with us, but the core constituency, right, the people who at the end of the day voted for you, say perhaps imagining that you were these social activists, that you were these radical activists, but then they find that, the rigors of parliamentary processes and the nature of this requiring politics requiring compromise and debate and so on, make you mellow down. How is this sold to the constituency to say, look, we have to do this, so keep faith in us?
So at one level, it's not sold enough, and I think that the party could do a lot more to try and persuade its core constituents of what they are doing. So I think there's a communication gap. But in Tamil politics, as with politics in many other parts of the world, there is also a material dimension to it. So, activists who spent their life, spending their hard-earned resources, giving up jobs, facing arrest in order to fight for a cause, now at least have the prospect of earning a living on the back of it. So the material rewards of political engagement have carried some of the activists along, so they're employed by the party, or they use the networks that the party has in order to carry out other tasks such as real estate work or, working for corporations and so on and so forth. So, you can use the networks of the political party in order to reward yourself. And that's actually in a context where politics is characterized by clientelist networks, then that's a powerful inducement to stick with the party, because in any other party, you don't have direct access to the leadership like you do in this one. So in terms of broadening out clientelist networks, the entry of a Dalit party makes a big difference.
Right. And I suppose in that sense, given the present parliamentary structure, and we'll get to this at a later point, given the present structure of parliamentary democracy in India, the only realistic path to gaining access to leadership, as you sort of pointed out, is to be able to, okay, fine, of all the options, at least they may have become more mellow or whatever it is, at least we have access to the leadership here. And I think that's a very interesting point about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that matters, on so many different levels. There's the material one, but actually as important is the sense of empowerment you have in being able to reach out to a representative who, you have some faith in. And that is deeply meaningful to people on the ground, the sense of one of us is now there who can speak on our behalf. And okay, they may not be speaking up as much as they used to, but at least they're there. At least they are able to articulate things in the corridors of power. So that's a powerful form of empowerment for the cadre on the ground, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. You also see, as part and parcel of that, because the VCK are campaigning, there's a changed look and feel to the political landscape. And you see that most simply and starkly in terms of wall paintings. So suddenly, as you're walking around and any city in Tamil Nadu or driving down the motorways, you see the banners and images of you see Tirumalavan's portrait everywhere. And again, you need to conceive of this in terms of a material change in the landscape and a huge source of empowerment for people, a sense of actually we are also part of this landscape now in a way that we never used to be.
Okay. There's the point you make around the material changes in the landscape is very interesting because it suggests that the process of institutionalization of Dalit political parties has also involved changes in the policy, in the platforms of other political parties. So, in the way that by the existence of the VCK, the way in which the DMK and the other political parties of Tamil Nadu have responded has also changed. So it is in some senses a mutually negotiated space that is the nature of electoral competition in that state.
To some extent, yes. So they'll always remember that, the Dalit parties in most states are operating from a position of weakness. So there is always dialogue that the other parties are forced to confront the fact that there is a party that can now take away Dalit votes, but the Dalit parties are still minor players, except for in UP. And so it's been an uphill struggle for the VCK to get the DMK and ADMK to take on board aspects of their platform. But you're right that the other parties have had to address the Dalit vote now in a way that they didn't before because they have an opponent.
Interestingly, what sort of, I suppose the three states where Dalit parties, and correct me if I'm wrong, who have a much higher level of representation seem to be Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and Uttar Pradesh. In terms of either having a lot of representatives or having a well-entrenched movement. I wonder what are some of the differences that we sort of see between these three states in terms of how the political parties approach and how much success and otherwise they've had. Because what would be interesting is perhaps answering the question, how did, say, a party like the BSP manage to, given that it is expressly a party, manage to not only just win elections often enough, but also on its own strength form the government in the state level?
And to add to that question, the idea that how much of it lies in party strategies and how much of it lies in the context, because the BSP did try to make an entry into Karnataka and haven't had much traction except for a couple of MLA seats in the past, and even now they do continue to contest in Karnataka for their national party status, I suppose, but remain a minor player in actual electoral politics. So where does that difference, if at all, come from?
Yeah, and to my mind, I think the single biggest difference is in the party structure of the two states. So in Tamil Nadu, you have a duopoly. One of two parties wins at any point. So you basically have a 50-50 split in the vote. In UP, you had, until recently, when the BSP have started losing, a four-way tie for electoral votes. So you had Congress, BJP, you had Samajwadi Party and the BSP. And so you could win on a smaller percentage of the vote. In many parts of UP, the Dalit population adds up to a quarter of the electorate. If you have a four-way split, then actually you can win on the basis of that. In Tamil Nadu, you don't have that. And so actually the party system makes a huge difference. And that would also explain why the BSP has not managed to emulate its success elsewhere. They've also stood candidates in Tamil Nadu and done very poorly. And to my mind, that is the single biggest difference. But beyond that, you also have to look at the history as well. And it's in UP and to a lesser extent Maharashtra, where Bamsef was strongest, where you had the mobilization that fed into the party. So you had this big build-up. You have the resources, you have the networks, you have the political education that feeds into elections, plus the party system, and you get success that can't be emulated elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah, and some of this, I suppose, and this is something that we sort of want to discuss a little bit more, perhaps has to do with the nature of, say, the Westminster parliamentary system of democracy that we have, specifically the first past the post system.
Absolutely.
And we have, even though, in our heads, this party wins elections or this person forms the government, it's actually an agglomeration of a certain number of assembly constituencies or Lok Sabha constituencies, which results in election win. And alongside the key choice that was made, and if we can trace it back to the Poona Pact, the key policy choice or the constitutional choice made was that Dalits will have reserved seats as opposed to separate electorates, which Ambedkar demanded. I wonder if, maybe this might be a bit of alternate history, but let's say, how much of this has impacted the way in which Dalit political parties have had to choose their tactics and choose their platforms and, do the work of representation of their community?
I think it's absolutely pivotal because you have reserved seats rather than separate electorates. As Gopal Guru has put it, non-Dalits decide which Dalit will win. You have to appeal to a non-Dalit audience in order to win in any constituency, because Dalits don't form the majority in any constituency. And so, just from that starting point, you're set at a disadvantage. You are unable to solely represent the interests of the Dalit community in a way that you would have been able to had you had separate electorates.
Right. And I suppose, in a sense, would like a separate electorate have made a difference? I mean, obviously, we're speculating a little bit here, but would it have changed the way how substantially would it have changed the way Dalit political parties, or would we have just seen that, Dalit parties are there, they represent a certain number of seats, but they never find themselves in power or in any real position of influence and change?
With counterfactual questions, it's always impossible to know. I would have thought that with separate electorates, Dalit politicians would actually have come into their own with the rise of coalition politics. So under Nehruvian rule, under Indira Gandhi to a lesser extent, they probably would have been disregarded and people would have wondered why they were there. But once you enter the coalition phase, then you could have had a block of autonomous independent Dalit MPs who could have been kingmakers. Right. So at that point, then there's real potential for them to make lasting and significant changes. But we will never know that. And what you have now that you would have hoped to avoid then is the creation of what Kanchiram called chamchas, or stooges of the parties, career politicians who are basically there to feather their own nest and not look out for the community. If you're accountable only to the community, then you have to represent them in a different way. So, the whole question of representation is altered by that pact.
Well, so moving away from the realm of counterfactuals which might have originated in history to the present moment, it's the second term of a right-wing government whose flank for both the elections, at least definitely the 2019 parliamentary elections, has focused on, in some ways, exclusive definitions of who belongs and who doesn't, as well as sort of a very problematic vision of nationalism. How do political parties such as the VCK find themselves responding to a context such as this, or to this kind of narrative, which is fairly pervasive, including in the state of Tamil Nadu, much more recently for sure?
I think the VCK are in an anomalous position, and you can't really generalize from their situation to other Dalit parties in India, because of course they're in the state of Tamil Nadu, and the VCK allied with the DMK both articulated probably the only forceful critique of the Hindutva agenda that you had across India. On the back of a positive, ideological, vehement critique of the ideology of the BJP, their coalition wiped out the opposition in Tamil Nadu. And so one can only wonder what might have happened had the Congress adopted that more positive campaigning strategy elsewhere across India.
Sorry, what does a positive campaigning strategy look like? I think that's something that is worth exploring a little bit.
Right. So it wasn't just saying, Modi's bad. He's done, he hasn't looked out for people. It offered people, the key strength of the BJP, in both in 2014 and in 2019, was they offered an aspirational campaign. They offered people who had nothing this vision of a prime minister who himself had risen, had gained social mobility, and they said, you too can benefit from this sort of social mobility. There was a sense of positive alternatives. We didn't have that. We were so busy, the opposition parties were so busy critiquing the BJP, that they failed to offer that alternative. So what you have in Tamil Nadu is the sense of we can do things better. So the ADMK government is broken, we will fix. They offered this alternative of a functioning government remaining true to the ideals of a Dravidian past, so pluralism was in there, tolerance for difference, tolerance of a whole range of different communities, combating marginalization, so all the sorts of things that offer positive hope to those at the bottom, rather than empty sense of a possible different future.
Right, and in a sense, even though like the Mahagathbandhan in UP between Akhilesh Yadav and the SP and the BSP, somehow that didn't seem to be able to articulate this.
No, it didn't, which is a shame, because if you actually look at their vote share, they didn't do too badly, but they failed to capitalize on any floating voters.
Exactly, yes.
And I think it's precisely because they didn't have that more positive campaign. They were so, you could possibly say they were complacent about the numbers. Either that, or they were so focused on the opposition that they failed to think, actually, we need more. We need to reach out beyond our core and attract others. Yeah, so that was a big failing on their part. I think that they retained their core vote. So it's not that their vote share collapsed. It's just that Congress did collapse, and BJP got everybody else.
Got all of the votes, yeah.
But then, the point around the core voter and beyond raises a very interesting question around Dalit political parties, which is that in an era of having to offer alternative visions and particularly cater to a non-Dalit vote base in order to be relevant in electoral politics, what does identity politics mean? How can political parties, or how do they even think of linking up with the social movements that they originated from? Because how do they think about linking up to the social movements that they originated from, and how are these compromises operationalized in this kind of political context?
So before we turn to that, just I think an important issue that we need to confront is we often see Dalit politics through the prism of identity politics. We forget the mainstream parties are deeply implicated in identity politics too.
Yeah.
You think about how the BJP or how the Congress or how any other party deals with the Dalit issue, it is through the prism of identity. So they'll launch, volumes of Ambedkar. They'll go and garland Ambedkar. They won't have any policy prescriptions. So the first point to make is that identity politics is not the preserve of the marginalized. It is widespread practice. Within that, I think, again, we need to avoid the seductions of the category. So Dalit politics allows for an all India frame, but that all India frame doesn't exist in practice. So the way in which the VCK can reinvent identity politics is as a Tamil nationalist party. So they use the local narratives and discourses in order to reinvent themselves, and that is precisely what they've done. So you have Divamar Valavan going to meet Prabhakaran towards the end of the war in Sri Lanka and continuing to talk about the LTTE. You have the whole protests around Jallikattu and the bull running and the defense of Tamil culture. You have all the debates about the defense of Tamil language. There are issues there for Dalit parties. So that's one way of fighting back against dominant parties. But within the state, you then have the question of, hang on a minute, the people who are attacking me are also Tamils. Caste discrimination occurs within Tamil Nadu as well as beyond. So then how do you reconnect with the core Dalit voters whilst you're trying to become Tamil? And that's a big issue that they've faced. And it's particularly pertinent when, in order to reach out to this wider group, the party brings in office bearers or leaders from other castes. And suddenly the core Dalit activists are saying, hang on a minute, I've given my life to this party. and somebody's being parachuted in above of me into a position of leader. And that's a really tight line for the leadership to walk. They need to persuade the core that reaching out to others is a victory in itself, whilst making sure that these newcomers at least pay lip service to Dalit core concerns. And it's perennial tension, and it's a really tricky one for the party to negotiate.
And that's a great point. And I think it's something that I suppose the BSP grappled with.
Absolutely.
In their run-up to even when they got power as well. In a sense, I guess there was a feeling that, in as much as Mayawati tried to stitch together this rainbow coalition of castes, not everyone felt that they got their necessary due, especially those who had signed up with the BSP rather, on the explicit agenda of on an explicit anti-caste agenda. So I guess this is something that maybe now, if say the VCK is now much more firmly entrenched within a DMK coalition, which say gets voted into power in Tamil Nadu in the coming years, perhaps it's something that they will have to grapple with.
Absolutely, yes, and it is an uphill struggle. It took 5 or 6 years of political coalition for the DMK to wake up to Ambedkar even. It was only on the back of Dalit pressure that the DMK leaders started embracing and garlanding Ambedkar on April 14. So even changes of a symbolic nature took a while to carry through, but slowly, as that alliance has stayed the course of time, you've seen a change in terms of recognition of the need to spend the provisions of the special component plan, the money set aside for Dalits, on Dalit issues rather than spending it all on the midday meal, which goes to everyone. So, there are areas where a small Dalit party can make an impact in terms of working on its allies.
Right. And I guess that sort of tells us that what are the potentials and what is the potential for Dalit political parties and what are the possible pitfalls and maybe where they might plateau. Again, given the current political system, given the manner in which India elects representatives and forms governments.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you do talk about it, which is the idea that even within the VCK, the criticism has been that that some of this has been reduced to symbolism, rather than necessarily something that actually enhances welfare.
Yeah.
So yes, that's absolutely true, but I do also try and make the point that it's too easy to talk about pure symbolism, because actually the symbols matter. Symbolic politics can have a material effect, and so things like the garlanding of Ambedkar is purely symbolic, but it sends out a message to the wider Dalit community that your hero is now accepted. And it goes beyond that, because slowly you have back in 2016 when you had a cross-caste murder, there was a cross-caste marriage, and you then had the groom being attacked in broad daylight and killed, and that neither the DMK nor the ADMK condemned the killing.
Right.
And more recently, actually, the DMK have come out and condemned caste atrocities. That they may just be paying lip service. They may not be doing anything more than a symbolic act, but that symbolic act is hugely significant. It's hugely powerful to people that now the main parties are talking about caste in a way that they didn't before. And I talked about wall paintings earlier. That changes the look and feel of the environment in which you walk. If as a young Dalit child, your icons are not just confined to the cherry, but also appear on the main road, that does wonders for your sense of self-esteem and confidence. So symbolic issues are not just symbolic, they also have a material component.
They have a material component. And I guess that sort of gives us a good framework to understand what Dalit parties are looking to achieve, and that we just simply can't measure progress only on material terms or the number of seats and so on, that their participation and their involvement itself ends up changing so much of the discourse and the way elections take place and the way politics is negotiated in India. I think with that, we have almost come to the end of our time for this particular episode. Thank you, Dr. Hugo, for joining us. It was really wonderful speaking to you. It was a very educative experience for us. We got a very different perspective on a lot of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. Really, really nice to be able to engage with people on this work.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Ganatantra. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.